Hello and welcome to Ye Olde Guide, the podcast guide to the history and heritage of the towns and cities of England, with a competitive twist. Whether you want to be primed for an upcoming trip, know more about England's towns, or gain a new perspective on where you live, this podcast is for you. Think of us part guidebook, part companion, part battle of the towns. I'm Liam McGrath, and together with my old friend and co-host historian Daniel Gooch, we will discuss a town and rate it for interest, influence and importance in 4 topical areas. In this episode, we're uncovering the hidden history of Reading. In our first category, culture, we discuss Oscar Wilde's imprisonment, Jane Austen's school, and one of the oldest popular music festivals in the world. I'm sure you've heard of it. In our second category, politics and war, we'll uncover the lost burial place of an English king and the only major battle of the last successful invasion of Britain. Science and industry, the industrial legacy of Huntley Palmers, once the world's largest biscuit manufacturer. And finally, urban heritage, the regenerated Abbey Quarter, Reading Gaol, and the exceptional patterned brickwork that adorns Reading's buildings. This episode contains some real surprises, so join us as we celebrate our own Festival of Reading. Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Ye Olde Guide. And this episode is a very special episode for you, Daniel Gooch, because we're going to your recently adopted hometown of Reading.
We are indeed. I think this is where I declare an interest. I've lived in Reading for 3 years, 4 years, something like that. So I know a bit about it. I've studied it before and I'm really looking forward to talking about it.
Do you consider yourself a Reading... What do you call someone from Reading?
I think you call them a Readingensian. I think that's the...
Readingensian.
That's certainly what you call someone who went to, I think, Reading School. There's a rugby team that until recently was called Readingensians Rams. So I think we can go with that. We'll go with Readingensian as our...
Great. You're Readingensian, and do you support the Royals?
No, I'm not that much of a...
No, that's a firm no.
Although my daughter was born here, so it's always possible she might end up supporting them.
I'd call that a risk. A risk that must be mitigated.
Well, she'll probably be happier than we as Ipswich fans are at the moment.
Brilliant. Oh God, let's not mention that. One of the benefits, of course, of you being a Readingensian is that we're able to do an episode about Reading in the middle of a pandemic lockdown because we know it. You know it very well, and I've been a few times, so I've visited you for tea. Yeah,
we know it. We've read about it. We've walked around it. We've been to the places. So absolutely, we're ready to go.
So that's how we've done it. So we'll do a quick overview of the history of Reading. Now, to me, when you arrive at Reading Station, the town looks and feels like a very modern, growing city. You've got that dramatic Grimshaw-designed station with its escalators and big sweeping platform roofs. And you see the logos for companies like Microsoft and Oracle, big accountancy firms, and you feel it's quite a young, business-orientated city. Dare I say it, before I got to know it, I'd say it was rather bland. And the only thing I really thought that went on there was the Reading Festival, which I'm sure we'll talk about. Mm-hmm. But as we're going to see in this episode, there's a millennium of history there and lots going on behind the shiny facade. So let's go to the beginning. Where did Reading start? What's our earliest evidence of a town at Reading?
Okay, I think we'll start the story in Saxon times. Because the earliest written record of Reading is in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, and this is in reference to the First Battle of Reading in 871. This was between the Saxon forces of Wessex and the invading Danes. We will talk a bit more about this in Politics and War, but essentially a small settlement had grown up in the centre of the current town, probably around about where St Mary's Church, also known as Reading Minster, is. There's a large road outside that. There was a marketplace there, and that's really kind of the origins of the original settlement. Reading was a fairly small place in Saxon times. In the Domesday Book, there were only 28 homes recorded. But what really helped Reading grow, and this is a theme we'll see a lot of this in this series, was the establishment of Reading Abbey. Now, Reading Abbey may not be too famous at the moment because it was destroyed mainly in the dissolution of the monasteries under Henry VIII and then later his son, Edward VI. But this was enormously important to Reading, not just as a centre of religious and ecclesiastical power, but really as a centre of political power. As we'll see later on, this was the site of 9 parliaments, of 3 royal weddings. It's the burial site of at least one reigning monarch of England, possibly more. So this really prestige to Reading. You can already see there's a lot more to it.
Wow. So there's a lot more going on here than we perhaps might have thought. As non-Readingensians, there seems like a lot here. What were the big industrial age changes to Reading?
Reading, for quite a long time, was a reasonably small market town, not even for a long time the biggest town in Berkshire. But what really changed was in the 19th century, Reading kind of used, if you can give a town agency, its position as a market and commercial centre for an agricultural area to build on this and create industries for processing these agricultural goods. There are what's traditionally known in Reading as the 3 Bs. These are bulbs, Sutton seeds, biscuits, Huntley and Palmers, which at one point was the biggest biscuit factory in the world. And then brewing, Simmons Brewery, which at one point produced 1 in 100 of every barrel brewed in the country. So these were really significant nationally and internationally famous businesses.
It sounds like we've got a lot to talk about in this episode after all.
I think
not just because it's your hometown. I mean, there's genuinely a lot going on here. But before we move on to the first category, I have to ask you this question. As a child, when I was reading my A to Z, I really struggled with Reading because I called it reading. And I've heard Americans calling Reading reading. Why does it have this rather bizarre place name?
Well, there are a few theories, but the name probably comes from an Anglo-Saxon tribe, which is the Redingas, whose name is said to mean just the people of Reda in Old People. So Reda was presumably the chief of that tribe. But certainly I've had the same problems looking it up. When I was researching Reading when doing my MA, trying to search for Reading history would get you all sorts of things about language and linguistics. So yeah, I feel that pain tenfold.
Yeah, I found it very difficult trying to look up Jane Austen and Reading. That didn't get me anywhere. Right. And our first category we're exploring in Reading is culture. Have we got any examples of some cultural influences from Reading?
Let's start with olden days, shall we? Let's go back to the Middle Ages. Liam, do you know the song Summer Is A Comin' In? You familiar with this?
I am. Do you want me to sing it?
I would love you to sing it, if you're happy to do so.
I'm not singing it.
That's a shame.
Tell us about this song then. How's it connected with Reading?
Okay, Summer Is A Comin' In. Well, bit of background first of all. This is probably one of the most famous English medieval songs. I mean, are there any more famous than that? I couldn't name you too many.
No, I couldn't name any.
It's known as the oldest known musical round with English words, and also the earliest surviving example of music where you could choose between secular and religious words. It's also the oldest song where possibly the word fart was used. And the Reading connection is that it was probably composed at Reading Abbey in the 13th century. Certainly the oldest copy that's in existence was found at Reading Abbey. And if you go to the Abbey ruins today, there's a manuscript of it put up as a plaque on the wall. So it's clearly been celebrated there. But really what this shows is that the Abbey wasn't just important for the religious and spiritual life of the town, or even the political life, but it was also a kind of cultural institution as well.
Well, I couldn't resist, I'm afraid, looking up the farting issue. Not because I'm making a thing of it, just because it was on the sign at the if you're going to bring it up on a sign in Reading. But I think people agree it doesn't mean farting in the kind of flatulence sense. It means sort of cavorting.
I think there's some dispute about it. No one's
okay.
It's one of those things. No, it's one of those things where it might be, it might not be, but it's interesting to mention it.
Okay, all right. Moving swiftly on from Summer Is Coming In.
Okay,
beautiful song. What else? What else could we say?
Well,
cultural influences of Reading.
Let's zip along to the present day, shall we? The one thing that Reading's probably best known for today, the Reading Festival.
Ah, yes, of course.
The major rock festival that's held in Reading, pretty close to the actual town itself. Every year on the August bank holiday. It's actually the world's oldest ongoing popular music festival. It was established in 1971. It started as the National Jazz Festival. It had a brief and pretty unsuccessful flirtation with pop music in the late 80s, which led to Bonnie Tyler, Meatloaf and others getting bottles and other very unpleasant things thrown at them. But now it's pretty established as one of the most important rock festivals in the country and probably the world.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, it's a big event on the summer calendar, isn't it? I must admit, I've not been, but you've lived in the town. What's it like in Reading during the festival?
I have been. I'm probably one of the few people who went and then went home at the end of every day rather than camping, which a bit of a luxury, but it's what you can do when you live there. What I'd say is the Reading Festival is reasonably unique because it's one of the few major festivals in this country which is actually intrinsically linked physically to a town. You do, of course, have some fairly major festivals in some of the London parks, like the Wireless Festival. When you're talking about standalone provincial towns, not part of a major metropolitan mass, there aren't really any more that are so intrinsically linked and connected with a town. How many more can you travel to by train? How many more can you just walk into the town centre, stock up on your wellies at Primark, when Primark, believe me, it stocks up on all the wellies pretty much in the southeast during the festival.
Wow.
How many more can you just walk into the Sainsbury's in the town, walk back to the festival? It doesn't really happen in many other places. So yeah, I think the Reading Festival, its connections to the town itself, in respect to the way it changes it, are pretty unique. And I would also have to say on the downside, never try getting a train from Reading Station on the Monday morning after.
No,
because you will not.
I can imagine. But no, it's a massive festival, and you look at the lineups over the years. So it had that jazz roots, as you say. But when the festival moved to Reading, I think it was 1971. You had those big prog rock artists to begin with. I think Genesis played the first year, and then all the sort of the big rock bands, New Wave. I think the Jam played. And then, as you say, it had that wobble in the 80s. I think it didn't run for a couple of years in the 80s. I think there was some dispute over the use of the land, but it's very much resurged as one of the biggest festivals, and it's had everyone. And it was where I think Nirvana had their last gig there. Kurt Cobain famously came on stage in a hospital gown, wheelchair.
Yeah,
because people were speculating about his mental health.
Yeah, and I think Reading.
Fascinating.
I think Nirvana released an album of possibly the performance they played before that one at Reading.
Wow, you can tell listeners that we like our music on this podcast.
We do.
We do. Okay, moving on from music. What about now? There's a Jane Austen connection in Reading. Is it a significant connection?
Kind of. Well, Jane Austen went to school in Reading. That's, I think, what we'll say. Actually, there's kind of a connection to Reading's urban heritage here, because the school she went to, Reading Ladies Boarding School, was actually established in the gatehouse for the Abbey, which is one of the few parts of the Abbey which is still standing. It's next to an office now, next to a garden area, which used to be part of the Abbey complex. But yeah, she went to a school there. And another interesting connection from there is the Reading Ladies Boarding School had a kind of successor school in London, I think in Knightsbridge, which Mary Russell Mitford, another author, attended. And her connection to Reading is not just that, but she actually lived near Reading. She lived just on the outskirts at 3 Mile Cross, which is not too far. I could walk there from my house quite easily. She wrote about Reading in her diaries. She called it Belford Regis. That was kind of the pen name for it. And her most famous work is about 3 Mile Cross, known as, the work is called Our Village. So it really did inform her work and her life.
So we do have some genuine literary influence.
When we talk about literary influence, we can't forget Oscar Wilde, of course.
No, of course not. No.
When Oscar Wilde was imprisoned for gross indecency, he was imprisoned in Reading Gaol. Reading Gaol, which still stands today. The cell in which Oscar Wilde stayed is still there. He wrote De Profundis while imprisoned there, which is kind of a passionate letter to Lord Alfred Douglas while he's imprisoned. It's almost like a kind of spiritual journey. It's a very famous work. It's been portrayed in theatrical drama many, many times. And he also wrote, inspired by his time there, the Ballad of Reading Gaol, which was about an execution that he witnessed there. So although he was only there for a couple of years, it clearly had a profound effect on his literary output.
He was jailed for gross indecency, which just meant being gay. Right?
Yeah, I think gross indecency was basically the crime you'll be convicted of if actual sodomy couldn't be proven.
Okay.
But yes, it was used to prosecute homosexual men.
let's talk about some of the more modern. I don't think we can not mention Ricky Gervais.
We probably have to mention Ricky Gervais. Yeah. Well, actually, there were quite a lot of kind of modern celebrity music, TV personalities that are from Reading. Mike Oldfield, Nasty Nick from EastEnders, Jeremy Kyle, Chris Tarrant, Kate Winslet, Kenneth Branagh. But the point with Ricky Gervais really is that being from Reading was pretty important to his work as well. His character, most famous character, David Brent from The Office, was from Reading. It's a series which is clearly set in a classic Thames Valley home counties town where everything's a little bit dull, which would be the perception people have of these places in Slough. But it still informed his work more directly as well. He had a film in, I think, 2010 called Cemetery Junction, which was about growing up in Reading back in his earlier days. Cemetery Junction is an actual place to the east of Reading where the roads meet around a cemetery. Was
it recorded in Reading? Are there shots of Reading?
I don't think it was mainly filmed in Reading, no.
Okay.
Which is a shame.
But I agree with you. I think you can really feel the sort of autobiographical almost influences of a sort of a Thames Valley office in the Office. I think you're absolutely right. So let's do the scoring for Reading now.
Yep.
Going into this episode, before learning about Reading, I wouldn't have expected much here, but there's a lot.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I'm always going to have to rein myself in here, being from the town, from either positive or negative bias. But I genuinely think this is one of the best ones we've had so far. It has something from kind of every genre, modern film. Bugsy Malone was filmed here as well. We never mentioned that in the old biscuit factory.
How did we miss that?
Has 19th century literary connections, the ones we've already mentioned. Plus, it featured prominently in Jude the Obscure by Thomas Hardy. Known as Old Brickham, it was a thinly veiled kind of cover name for the town.
Right.
It was kind of portraying this town, to my mind, as kind of a refuge where the transgressive lovers can find acceptance, and actually described in the book as a finer town than all your Christminsters. Christminster being the name for Oxford that he used. And as I mentioned earlier, I think what you've got is major cultural institutions of the Abbey and the festival throughout kind of Reading's entire existence as a town. So I think this is pretty positive. It's not going to be the enormous scores, and these are really for the same reasons that we've mentioned before, that you need something that's genuinely world-changing to have come from the town, like a brand new musical genre, something like that, to get that. But I think it's pretty good, so I'm going to give it a 5.5.
I'm going to give it a 6. It's more than I expected, and I think it's quite interesting. And I like the symmetry of one of the oldest pieces of music that we know. Summer Is A-Coming In, an up-to-date Reading festival.
Fantastic. That's 11.5 in total. Decent score.
Not bad. Moving on now to politics and war.
Let's start with the war side of things. I think that's probably the best way to do it. What lots of people don't know about Reading, people who live in Reading don't know this, is there have been 3 pretty significant battles in Reading, and actually in Reading town centre, not even just near Reading.
You mean people literally kind of shooting out of their windows, kind of fighting in the streets, kind of?
That has happened. Shooting out the windows has happened. Let's start with that one. The Glorious Revolution, 1688. We'll go back in time. The Glorious Revolution is worth a recap here because it's almost kind of forgotten how important.
Yeah, it's worth a very very quick recap if possible.
Yeah, the Glorious Revolution was basically the time when, in 1688, the Catholic monarch James II was overthrown, deposed, and the Protestant Dutch prince William of Orange became joint monarch of England with James's daughter Anne, became William III. Now, this is significant because if you ask the average person, when was the last time that England was invaded by a foreign power, when was the last time a monarch was deposed, they would tend to say 1066, Battle of Hastings, but no.
Absolutely.
There is this myth around the Glorious Revolution that William was invited in and just walked onto the throne and pushed James off. No, this was a full invasion with a full army of many thousands of people. This was not just a walking invitation of one man. And
So he came in with with a lot of men, 14,000, but there were a lot of people that supported him.
There were.
Is that right? Because they didn't like the king because he'd done, without getting into too much, he'd done a lot to annoy people, I think.
Yeah. Well, I think the issue for William was that James, being a Catholic, had two Protestant daughters. William was married to one of them. And William was kind of almost alone in Europe as a Protestant king. He needed allies. Had James's new son survived to become king and been brought up as a Catholic, William would have been alone without Protestant allies in Europe. So make no mistake, he had agency in this. It was William's decision to invade as much as anyone else's decision to invite him to take over the country. And the consequences were quite profound because this really settled the debate of whether we had an absolute monarchy, the old divine right of kings that had been raging for years and was one of the main causes of the Civil War. Once William became king, the Bill of Rights was issued, and essentially the monarch could never govern again without the consent of Parliament. It was Parliament that was supreme. So this had really profound consequences for the country. Now, what's the connection with Reading? Is probably what you're going to ask.
Yes, that's what I was thinking.
The connection with Reading is that the only military act, the only battle of the entire invasion happened in Reading, in the very centre of Reading today. The Battle of Broad Street. Now, Broad Street is the main shopping centre that runs through the town today. It's got W.H. Smith on it. It's got the Oracle Shopping Centre, Waterstones, all the normal high street shops. What happened was there were about 500 of James's forces staying there, billeted there, and they were mainly Irish. Now, there was lots of mistrust of the Irish forces from the Reading townfolk. So they sent word to William's forces, I think there was some of them stationed at nearby Hungerford, that they were there and asked them to come and emancipate the town. The forces in Reading town, James's forces, blocked up Castle Street, a street which is still there, kept their main force in the Market Square. Again, a place which is still there. You can actually walk around and see these places today. But rather than coming up Castle Street, the William's forces came up Oxford Road instead, which is just to the west leading into the town centre, leading directly onto Broad Street. There was a skirmish, a pretty bloody skirmish. 50 of the Irish were dead, the rest ran away. And most of those 50 were buried in the graveyard of St Giles Church, which is just to the south of the present town centre. Now, the consequences of this, I don't want to overplay it because one of its other names is the Reading Skirmish. It wasn't a huge battle. And if we're doing comparisons with Hastings, it was nothing like on that scale. But it was the only military action of this campaign. And there are a fair few historians who are pretty convinced that having lost this one skirmish convinced James he had no way, despite having the superior military force in respective numbers, that he could win this war, and he fled shortly afterwards. So really a very important event in English history and a crucial and unique role for Reading in that.
Yeah, so a skirmish outside Marks and Spencer
absolutely.
Has changed the leader, changed the king.
Yep, it changed the king. It changed the political settlement of the country forever as well.
There was two other battles. There was a battle in the Civil War.
The Civil War, yes.
1643, I think.
Yeah, that's right. So 1643, there was a siege of Reading. Now, I don't think we need to give quite so much background, but essentially the Civil War was the war between parliamentary forces and the royalist royal forces over many issues. There were religious issues, there were political issues, but essentially over numerous. Complicated. Exactly, but at least. Basically over the right of kings to rule as they saw fit. That was a key part of it. Now, Reading was in a pretty important location strategically because you had the royal stronghold of Oxford and the parliamentary stronghold of Windsor. It was kind of equidistant between the two. It also had really good water and road access because of its roads that ran in, and the two rivers, the Kennet and the Thames, which converge in Reading. And that meant it controlled a lot of the important agricultural land around it in the county of Berkshire. Now, the town switched between sides a few different times during the war. Lots of soldiers stayed here, and the Civil War was also pretty ruinous for the cloth trade, which had been pretty important to the town up to that point. But the siege itself, as you said, happened in 1643. You had 19,000 parliamentarians versus 3,300 royalists billeted in the town. It lasted for 11 days, and there are some pretty major defences built around the town. One of them actually went through my house, because the town went further south back then. Pretty much where I'm sitting now was on the Civil War defences. But one bit you can actually see still today in the Forbury Gardens, which is a small park right in the town centre next to the Abbey ruins. There is a small hill there, the Forbury Hill. This archaeological evidence, stressed very strongly, was built as defences for the Civil War. So you can walk up there. I did it the other day, and just be in the same place where people were defending the town during the Civil War siege.
So Reading then subsequently changed hands a few times because of its location at the confluence of the Kennet and the Thames. What other major political influences would you identify from Reading?
I think for political influence, you have to go to the Abbey again. The Abbey, as we've said before, and we can say it again, really gave Reading a centre of political power, and it had. It was the site of 9 parliaments, as we mentioned earlier. There were one in the 12th century, 2 in the 13th, 2 in the 14th, 4 in the 15th, several church councils.
What does that really mean in terms of the government of the country at the time? What was the significance of that? Is it in any way comparable with what we mean by the Parliament today?
Well, the king had much more power at these parliaments. Essentially, it was the way that the king would gather together nobles of the land, and later on the commons as well. Commons not in the sense that we'd understand it today, but commons as in the non-nobility who would have a right to sit at the parliament, and really discuss the important political topics of the day. So no, it wasn't a parliament in the same way that we know it today, but it was the makings of it. And I did try to look at what of significance happened at these parliaments. I'm not sure too much did happen, but one quite interesting little tidbit is that the noble rank of Viscount was created at the 1440 Parliament. So there's a little bit of something that came to us from there. But I think if you want to look at consequences of meetings in Reading, we have to look beyond just parliaments and look at something that happened in 1185 when Heraclius, the Patriarch of Jerusalem, came to Reading Abbey to plead with Henry II to come to his aid to defend Jerusalem. Now, to give some context here, the Patriarch of Jerusalem, it's kind of a religious title, a bit like an archbishop, and this was during the Crusades, when the Crusaders held Jerusalem. Now, Henry II was said to be moved by Heraclius' pleadings, but ultimately didn't go. And 2 years later, Jerusalem fell to Saladin's forces. Now, I don't want to go too far down the alternative history route. There is an interesting little kind of bit of intrigue there. What if Henry had said yes? What if Henry had gone? What if they'd held on to Jerusalem for a bit longer? Other things that happened at the Abbey. I think we can talk about royal weddings as well. Three of Edward III's children were married there, including John of Gaunt, a fairly major figure in the Wars of the Roses. And speaking of Wars of the Roses, Edward IV announced his marriage to Elizabeth Woodville there at the Council of Peers. Now, if you've not come across Elizabeth Woodville before, she was a fairly major figure in the Wars of the Roses, certainly the later Wars of the Roses. Much of the fighting, much of the consternation between the two forces was between her family and Edward IV's family. So this is a pretty important moment in the Wars of the Roses when the marriage was announced.
Right, so it turns out there was quite a lot to talk about in politics and war for Reading.
Indeed, and there's one more battle to talk about as well, very briefly.
Oh, we've missed a battle.
We missed it. Well, we talked
Battle
briefly
of
about
Reading.
it earlier.
The first one.
The first Battle of Reading. This was in 871.
Very long, going way back.
We are going way back. Now, we talked a bit about this earlier, so not so much to add to this. This was when the invading Danish forces made camp at Reading, probably outside where the Minster is now, where the Saxon settlement was, and the forces of Wessex attacked. The Danes held on to Reading. What's intriguing about this is that the settlement of Reading, the town itself, is where the battle took place. So you can actually walk to the place now where it took place. Many of these battles around this time would have been near settlements or around settlements. This actually happened in Reading today. In the site of Reading today.
Oh, wow. So we've had 3 quite important battles. Well, important by the standards of a urban battle in England, I think we can say they're significant. Yep. And we've had this really important monastery, one of the most important monasteries in the country with significant royal connection. So I think there's quite a lot there. So I'm just coming to my scoring now. My feelings on Reading's history in this area really has evolved over the course of thinking about this episode. And I'm actually going to give it a 7 because of the significance of the Abbey in political history at that time, and the fact we've been able to talk about these battles, particularly the Battle of Broad Street, the skirmish, which is very interesting to have a street battle in an English town.
Okay, so that's a 7 from you. I think for me, there are kind of 3 elements I'm thinking about here. Number 1, for a town, and it is a town, not a city, of this size, could you really have expected more? Could you really be looking for more than 3 major battles, parliaments, important political meetings with international and national leaders? I'm not really sure that you could. You might get one-offs. You might get events that have happened at fairly important medieval cities, but for somewhere that was never a particularly huge or significant settlement by size, I don't think you're going to get much better than this for importance. The next thing I want to mention is that a point we've touched on before, everything we've talked about happened in Reading, not near Reading, not around Reading, actually in Reading. And you can go to Reading today and actually look at the sites where this happened. You can stand where the Battle of Broad Street happened. You can go to the Abbey ruins. You can stand near where Henry I is buried. It's actually there in the very centre of the town. The third point is how well is it celebrated today, which is perhaps a point we didn't touch on so much before.
Yeah. I
think this is perhaps where there's a little bit of negativity. I don't think Reading makes as much of this as it should. I know people from...
No, I agree.
Absolutely no idea these things have happened there. None at all. I mean, the Abbey ruins themselves, they were closed for the best part of a decade when I first moved here. They have thankfully opened. But I think if you could have some kind of fantastic, tangible heritage really celebrating the historical importance of Reading, that would really be something that would bring this up to the really high scores. But I will mention the fact there is intangible heritage in Reading. There are groups celebrating Reading. There's a chap who runs walking tours of Reading. You don't get that in every provincial town. They're very good. I've been on them myself. There's a theatre company which produces plays about Reading's history. It does performs in some of the old churches, some of which were built using the stones from Reading Abbey ruins. So about as close to kind of the original buildings that you can get. And those are really, really good. So you can tell I've given this a lot of thought. But I think I'm going to give Reading a 7.5.
Right, let's go on to science and industry, where you're going to tell me all about the 3 Bs. So you mentioned the 3 Bs in the introduction. Now, I must confess, when you first mentioned 3 Bs to me a few months ago when we were talking about the history of Reading, and you said bulbs, I thought you meant light bulbs. That was a bit embarrassing. You meant seeds.
I didn't mean
so
seeds.
3 Bs. Tell us about the 3 Bs.
Okay, you're absolutely right. Bulbs should really mean seeds. The 3 Bs that Reading's industry famous for industrially are bulbs or seeds, brewing, and biscuits. And I think we'll start with biscuits. Yep. I'm talking here. We
all like biscuits.
We do like biscuits. And if we asked our grandparents or even our parents, perhaps, who was the big biscuit manufacturer when you were young, I think they would have said Huntley and Palmer. Huntley and Palmer, biscuit factory, again, based right near the centre of Reading, was the biggest biscuit factory in the world by 1900. It was established in 1822, actually in a shop to the south of Reading. Really, the interesting thing about Reading's kind of urban development is there are a lot more kind of old buildings into the south of the town, which we'll talk a bit more about in urban landscape. But because this was one of the old retail centres of the town, not just where it is now, and there was a Huntley and Palmer shop established there, and there's a plaque on there marking the site. But in 1846, the business got bigger. It moved to its current factory site. It was a huge factory complex, and it had a really quite enormous railway system as well that was linked directly to the national railway line, the Great Western Main Line, which ran nearby. And in fact, people used to go on railway excursions to the biscuit factory, which would take you straight into the factory complex itself from wherever you boarded. Now, really, what you've got here is an internationally famous biscuit brand. Not just that, but several types of biscuit were invented here. Have you ever had the Garibaldi?
I can't say I have.
Have you ever had a Nice biscuit?
Well, I've certainly had that.
The Nice.
Delicious.
Well,
very sugary.
I hate both of them, so I blame Huntley and Palmers for them, but I know I'm in the minority there. So we'll give them credit for these biscuits being invented there. The factory ceased production in 1976. There was a big merger of some of the major biscuit brands in the country. It lived on in Reading folklore for a bit because Reading FC's Reading Football Club's nickname for a while was the Biscuit Men. It changed to the Royals a few years ago. Personally, I think the Biscuit Men is much better.
It's much better. I don't think you can change your nickname like that.
Well, plenty of clubs have. Sunderland come up with the Black Cats. Sorry, this isn't a football podcast. Let's not go.
No. Sorry. Back to coffee. Back.
But actually, the Huntley and Palmers brand has been revived. There is a firm in Bury St Edmunds which has been making Huntley and Palmers biscuits since 2006. You can actually pick them up in Reading Museum gift shop.
I'm glad. I was going to ask you if it was possible to get hold of the old biscuits, but you've answered the question before I've asked it. Brilliant. What about booze? What about brewing?
Brewing. Well, Reading wasn't unusual in the kind of early 19th century and late 18th century in having breweries, because this is pretty common for a market town of this size.
Every town had a brewery.
It did, but it really builds on the point I mentioned earlier, that Reading was an agricultural processing centre. It could get barley from its agricultural hinterland. Initially, malted barley was kind of shipped onto London down the Thames. Once that was canalised, that made it a lot easier. But the next development there was actually brewing on site, and there was an enormous brewery built on the Kennet, kind of where the Oracle shopping centre is now. There are a couple of small remnants of it left. I think the original malt house is there, and another small building which was until recently a Lochfine restaurant. But this was a really big factory as well, the Simmons Brewery. As I mentioned earlier, 1 in 100 of every barrels of beer brewed in the country at one point was brewed at that factory. So it really was quite enormous.
No, that is incredible. And I think you're right to highlight that the connectivity that the Kennet navigation gave it. Because as I understand it, Reading had water access to both the Thames and via a system of canals through the country to the Severn Estuary ultimately. So you had access to both sides, and then of course you had the railway came along, and Reading was a hub. So as we said with Swindon, the railways make a town, and I think they played their part in Reading as well. What about the other one? What about seeds? Bulb seeds.
Well, this is Sutton Seeds. Now, Sutton Seeds was, as you would expect, a seed manufacturer, and what they did, they were very good, very kind of early innovators of selling seeds directly to commercial buyers, to individuals. You know how you buy seeds in foil packets now? You might pop down the co-op and they're selling them on a rack in foil packets. Sutton Seeds were the first firm to do that. They were the first firm to start doing that. They used to sell them on the railways because the railway line, again, ran right close to the Sutton Seeds factory. Sutton Seeds left Reading in 1976, but it's still an established brand. It's now based in Paynton. But the Reading connection is still there because the Museum of English Rural Life is in Reading, in the south of Reading, near the Royal Berkshire Hospital.
Interesting museum.
It is. It's part of the university's London Road campus, I believe. And the Sutton Seeds archives and records are based there, so you can go there and learn all about Sutton Seeds.
Okay. And any other major industrial successes from Reading we should know about?
Less well known today, but Cox Reading sauce was a sauce that also was just known as Reading sauce, which was manufactured in Reading in the 19th century. It had a pretty large factory where Reading Central Library is now. So again, right in the town centre. Yeah. It was a bit like Worcester sauce, is how it's described. The main ingredients: walnuts, mushroom ketchup, soy sauce, and anchovies. And it's actually mentioned in 2 literary works, a Lewis Carroll poem, and more significantly, the book Around the World in 80 Days. Phileas Fogg has this on his breakfast at the Reform Club.
Oh, I don't blame him. It sounds like quite a nice sauce to chuck on your breakfast.
It does. It was actually revived a few years ago. There's a restaurant on the outskirts of Reading which decided to brew some up.
So brilliant. I thought you were going to say devoted itself to the sauce and you just chucked the sauce on. I suppose it has.
Do that at the museum cafe, shouldn't they? You should get your Huntley Palmer biscuits, some Cox Redding sauce on it, and a pint of Simmons beer. That'll do.
Sounds pretty. It's a little project for you next year.
Yeah, I'll put that to the Reading Tourism Board. See if they'll.
And you we'd better mention John Medeski.
We'll mention John Medeski.
Figure.
Absolutely. Well, John Medeski, he's one of these people, kind of a local magnate whose name is plastered on all sorts of things in Reading.
The stadium I'm thinking of.
Yeah, the Medeski Stadium for the football club. There's a gallery at the museum, because really he's kind of Reading's modern day biggest benefactor stroke most prized son, if you like, if you don't count Ricky Gervais. And the source of his kind of fame and wealth was he founded Auto Trader here in the mid-1970s, Auto Trader, the Castle magazine, which is now all online. Originally, it was a magazine that sold anything, but it then later focused on cars, and that's how he made his fortune. And still to this day, he is chairman of Reading FC.
So before we do the scores, as I said in the intro, I think it's worth saying that in our age, Reading really is like an important business commercial centre. And I was just looking at some stats on Centre for Cities, and Reading is, outside London, one of the most productive cities in the country in terms of GDP per capita, and it's also got one of the highest density of businesses per capita. And there's some major firms there, Microsoft, Oracle, and others. So even today, it's maintained its importance as a business centre. So it's reinvented itself in that way, and it's relatively wealthy as a result. So I thought there was a lot here, and again exceeded my expectations. I think with this category, it's about, for me, how much influence the industrial innovation or the scientific innovation, the business innovation, how much influence it's had on the world. And you mentioned a couple of things: the biggest biscuit exporter or manufacturer, I think you said, the brewery, and the innovations of the seeds with the foil bags. These are quite important, so I will give it a good score. But it doesn't sort of punch up with the big mega industrial cities of perhaps to the north of England and your big university towns. So I'm going to give it. We're allowed to give halves, right? So I'm going to give it a 6.5.
6.5, that's decent. Yeah, I gave two halves earlier, actually. 2 halves already, so no problem with that. I think with Reading, I'm almost preempting reality versus expectations with this, but I'll try and keep it separate. The question again is, what can you expect of a town of this size? And I think to say for a town of Reading's size that it's had an internationally famous brand produced here, the largest of a specific industry, the largest biscuit factory in the world, and other major industries here as well that were kind of nationally famous, is really something quite significant. I don't think many towns are going to have that. And it does have, if you're talking about kind of modern celebrations, it does have a bit of a connection. Because, as I mentioned, the Museum of English Rural Life has that connection with the agricultural hinterland, which is, as the point I keep making, is what drove a lot of the early industry in Reading. I suppose what you don't have, you're absolutely right, there's nothing that's changed the world. There's nothing that is a specific innovation that is uniquely innovative about Reading. And if you're going to talk about heritage celebration, well, you've got the Museum of English Rural Life. If you compare it with, say, the Transport Museum in Coventry or Steam in Swindon, the celebration doesn't come up to that. So I think it's going to be positive again, but I'm going to give it a 6. So that's 12 and a half total.
Moving on to urban landscape, and what strikes me when I visit Reading, one of its best attractions, most of its well-known attraction, is the Abbey area and the surrounding gardens. Do you want to reflect a bit on that area before we move on to other parts of the town?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it might be helpful to talk a bit about why it was established. The Abbey was built by Henry I, who was the third oldest son of William the Conqueror, and came eventually after the death of his older brother William II to inherit the English throne. Now, there are various theories about why he built Reading Abbey. Interesting one that George Bradshaw, the old railway writer, gave is that he suggested it was to atone for putting out his older brother Robert Curthose's eyes, which is a bit grisly. Okay. But the reality potentially is that he just wanted a family mausoleum and some monks to pray for his soul and his family's souls when they died. And Reading was a convenient location west of London on the route to the further west parts of the country, like Bristol, like Oxford, and good for navigation. Now, what survives of the Abbey today is a reasonable amount, but it is all in ruins. It was mainly ruined after the dissolution of the monasteries under Henry VIII, but I think his son Edward VI basically sold the building off to his uncle, and then after that, loads of it was basically cast all over Reading for building other buildings. St Mary's church, the old Reading Minster, when that was rebuilt, had some of the old stone from the Abbey put into it. The old Abbey Mill, which is still there, that was partially rebuilt later on using stone from the old Abbey. And actually later on, during the Civil War, Charles I ordered that part of it should be destroyed. And now, if you go to the car park of the Catholic Church, which is the small Catholic church, which was built later on in the Abbey precinct, there are some massive chunks of wall of masonry which have fallen to the ground since Charles I had the walls demolished, which have just been left there because they're too heavy to move. They're just kind of standing there, almost like monuments. What you still have remaining there are a few buildings which are kind of generally recognisable as proper inhabitable buildings now. You have the Abbey Gateway, which we mentioned earlier, which was substantially restored in the 19th century. You have the Hospitium. The Hospitium, I think, now has been turned into a nursery as well. This was where guests would stay at the Abbey, and there were lots of guests who came on pilgrimage there to see the Hand of St James, which is now in a church in Marlow. But that was one of the main relics for the Abbey. And the Hospitium was actually used as stables by Henry VIII when he reused part of the Abbey building as a royal palace for a short time. And
so Hospitium, that's like a hotel, are you saying?
Yeah,
like hotel, as in lodgings.
As in hospitality.
Hospitality, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
And you also have St Lawrence's Church, which is there, which is, I think, kind of a youth and arts centre now, which is kind of on the outskirts of the old Reading Abbey complex.
Okay, so there's bits of it left. I think, as you say, it is ruins. Near to there in the gardens is the large lion, the large cast iron lion, quite a big statue. That's sort of a symbol of Reading. What's that to commemorate, and what's the story behind that lion?
The lion is to commemorate imperial wars, I think, in Afghanistan. It's kind of a military monument to the dead of that campaign. Yeah. But really, its place in local folklore is a bit of a myth that's grown up, that the pose of the lion is inaccurate, that the architect based it on the pose of a domestic cat, later realised his mistake, that it was all wrong, and killed himself when he found out. This is just one of those facts that everyone from Reading knows. Liam, on the truthometer, if we can get your truthometer out, do you think this is true?
Well, I happen to know it's complete nonsense.
You know well.
And the poor sculptor George Simmons, of the brewing family that you've talked about, he actually spent years learning, researching how to draw very accurate lines and how to model very accurate lines. So the story's rubbish, and he lived for years after. He also created the statue of Queen Victoria in, I think, is it Town Hall Square?
Yeah, that statue of Queen Victoria, if you ever go up to it, you'll notice it's missing a finger. And that finger was blown off by a bomb during the Blitz in the Second World War. Ah. And they never reattached it. If you go into Reading Museum, the finger is in there. Okay,
so that was George Simmons as well. Yeah. Now, let's talk a bit about the building styles you see in Reading, because it's quite... Once you walk around Reading, you see a number of different styles, don't you?
I think you do, but I think what this all comes back to, your appreciation of the architectural style of Reading, comes back to its small town centre, which has held more or less the same shape since the Middle Ages. The town of Reading has always been based on this long, thin triangle shape. If you think about Friar Street at the top of Reading, which runs parallel with the railway, there are two roads which come down and a couple of miles further south meet up. And Reading has always been within this triangle. Now, this has kind of constrained the town centre quite a lot. And I'd say if you're in the town centre, it's mainly modern or kind of Victorian and Edwardian buildings. But once you stray around the peripheries of the town centre, you have, obviously, if you're going to talk about medieval architecture, you've got churches, but also the Abbey, of course. But you also have more Georgian buildings if you go to the south, Regency Bath stone buildings, lots of grand houses if you go to the east and to the west.
It's quite impressive.
Yes,
quite impressive
absolutely.
Architecture. Yeah,
I think it is, and the Royal Berkshire Hospital has kind of this very grand Bath stone neoclassical frontage in that area, and also you've got a small model village there. We talked a bit about model villages, Victorian model villages in the Swindon episode, where workers' houses were built in kind of a unified style to a reasonable standard, and this is in the just to the east of the town centre in Newtown. These were houses for the biscuit factory workers. So you've really got kind of the combination of medieval street layout and architectural diversity, which is enough to keep anyone interested, I think.
You've also got quite a curious type of long, thin building, haven't you? So some of the shopping area, you've got these very narrow, kind of building.
You have. So if you look at the main shopping street, Broad Street, which we've talked about obviously a lot today, that runs parallel with Friar Street just to the north. And in between Broad Street and Friar Street, you've got lots of long, thin shops like W.H. Smith. You can walk in W.H. Smith from Broad Street and emerge through the other end at Friar Street. Now, the reason why there are so many long, thin shops there, including W.H. Smith, is really because of the way the land was packaged off in Norman times. This is reasonably unique for a town centre in England. This way of packaging off land was known as burgage. Essentially, you would get a house on the road and you'd get the land that fed off in a long, thin strip behind it. And these plots of land have just really emerged into kind of this shopping layout, this layout of land ownership that you see in Reading town centre today.
Yeah. And the other two striking things, I think, in the town centre are the brick patterns on the, if you look above the shop fronts, you've got those brick patterns. And also, and I think you alluded to it, there's some really great examples of late Victorian architecture, and some very famous Victorian architects that, are known for their buildings in London and other cities, have examples in Reading as well.
Yeah, George Gilbert Scott, who most famously designed St Pancras Station and the Albert Memorial, he built Reading Gaol. Now, Reading Gaol is a pretty large complex. It's built right next to the Abbey. They back onto each other. And to be honest, it's so grand that when you're standing there with the Abbey in front of you and the jail behind it, it almost looks a bit like Hampton Court, that kind of brick back of area of Hampton Court sometimes. It's got a palatial feel to it. It's got a reasonably interesting history, not just the literary history we looked at earlier for Oscar Wilde, but it's also held military prisoners as well, Irish prisoners during the Easter Rising, interned foreigners during both World Wars. It's now Grade 2 listed, but it is owned by the government, which is planning to sell it since it closed in 2013.
Okay, so it could be redeveloped into a nice bar or restaurant.
It could be. I think it'd be wonderful if it could be turned into some kind of heritage centre, but I think it's more likely it will just get sold off for housing. I think that's the most likely destination for it.
Oh, and the other thing I think we wanted to talk about was the modern development. So we've got I mean, for me, what's quite striking is obviously the Oracle Centre, but also it has suffered from a major inner distribution road as well. So it's got those examples of sort of sweeping modernity from the post-war era. But let's talk a bit about the Oracle Centre. So you mentioned earlier that was the site of the brewery, Simmons Brewery, and that's now a sort of a shopping, retail, leisure complex. Is that right?
That's right. Well, it wasn't just the site of the brewery, because the shopping centre is quite big. It occupies the brewery's part of the brewery's waterside kind of frontage area. Obviously, there are obvious advantages in building an industrial building like a brewery on a waterfront next to a canal, but also extends onto the land covered by an old workhouse, which was called the Oracle, and that's where it gets its name from. Right. If you walk up Gun Street now, which is a road that's just between John Lewis and the Oracle, there's a funny bend to that road, and there's a rather nice coffee cart there, a coffee stall. And right where that coffee stall is where the old gates for the Oracle were. And those gates are actually in Reading Town Hall now, still in there.
There's a lot there, actually. Let's go on to the scoring. I'm quite a big fan of Reading, actually. I think there's a lot of good architecture there, spanning the ages and different examples. And I didn't mention, somehow, how have I forgotten this? I forgot to mention the station. Grimshaw's architects, that's an incredible piece of modern architecture. There is a lot there, but I don't feel when I walk around Reading, it's not always that well presented. It doesn't feel dramatic. So I'll give it a respectable score, but it doesn't blow me away. I think I'll give it a 5.
I think for me, Reading is one of those towns which has what you want if you're prepared to look for it. If we compare it back with Swindon, Swindon was excellent. And I think it had something that was dramatic and would sweep you away in the railway area. Yeah. But the rest of the town, it wasn't there. And I think with Reading, despite having the Abbey ruins, and it really is quite amazing that so much has survived in such a central area, there isn't at the moment anything there that would sweep you away, that is that dramatic, as you said. There is the potential for it. Reading could have... If you could build some kind of fantastic modern multi-century visitor centre near the Abbey ruins, which would tell the story of Reading and its importance in history, it would have something like that to make the most of what it's got. Same with the jail. If you could put the jail to some kind of heritage use, that could be the building that does that. I mean, you imagine being able to go in and actually visit Oscar Wilde's cell where he wrote De Profundis. That would be fantastic. And it was open for a short time recently. It has to get a reasonable score because it has that kind of striking juxtaposition for stars if you look for them. And we talked about the patterned brickwork. There's lots more of that around the town centre, actually, rather than in the town centre. The 3 Bs are sometimes called the 4 Bs because there were so many brick kilns in Reading. And my house is actually, again, on the site of an old brick kiln. Quite a lot happened on the site of my house. It's just slightly let down by the way it's presented today and the fact that you actually have to go looking for it. So I think I'm going to go with a 4.5.
Now we're moving on to reality versus expectations. So this is the section where we look at the things we've talked about and try to compare them with what we might expect from the reputation or size of the town. And I think Reading's going to do rather well in this section. What do you think, Daniel?
I think you're absolutely right. I think Reading is one of these places, again, where very little is expected. I think even people who live and work in Reading wouldn't be able to tell you very much about the history of Reading. Apart from the festival, that's probably the one thing it is well known for. Yeah. But I mean, when I popped down to Aldi the other day, Aldi just the other side of the station, do some shopping. On that walk, it just struck me. I passed the site of 9 parliaments, 3 royal weddings, a Civil War siege, 2 other major battles, 2 internationally famous businesses, significant moments in the Crusades and the Wars of the Roses, Oscar Wilde's imprisonment, and the burial site of up to 3 English monarchs. I don't think there are very many towns at all in this country where you could get anything like that on your daily walk to the shops. The criticism you'd make is that it could make so much more of what it has, and I think this might be an
that was going to be my criticism. My criticism was going to be, yes, all that is true. Yes. All that is true. But what do you see on your walk to Aldi? What you're just seeing generic shops, aren't you? And I suppose you see the ruins of the Abbey, but there's just not much tangible there.
It's true, and it obviously depends what route you take. You can walk through the Abbey ruins now. You can walk through the Forbury Gardens. You can climb up to the top of that mound where Reading was defended against the Parliamentary Army during the Civil War. But you might not know that that's where you're on top of. You might just think this is a big hill someone's put in a park. I think the museum, there is an effort being made in Reading Museum at the moment to tell a bit more of the story of Reading, but there is so much more that could be done. There is some kind of fairly thriving intangible heritage here. We've mentioned it before, but there is the chap who does walking tours of Reading, and you've got, as I mentioned, that fantastic theatre company that does the plays about important moments in Reading's past. And I can't believe that more isn't done on that, particularly by kind of local history groups. It should be something that every Reading school child is knowing about, something that's really much more in your face when you are walking through the centre of Reading. I think it's going to be a good score for the importance. It could be a phenomenally high score if there were just a little bit more made of it today. Why don't you give me your thoughts? Because I'm going to mull over them a little bit more.
It's hard, isn't it? From the point of view of this podcast and what I've learned from this episode, I'm minded to give it a good score because of all those things you've mentioned, particularly the Abbey, the parliamentary history, the biscuit factory. There's a lot there. Yeah. I'd give it a good score. My problem is I've been there quite a lot and I like Reading. I think actually it's got one of the better town centres, of many British town centres, particularly in the southeast. We've got a lot of fairly bland places in the southeast. I think Reading's got character. It's got that Victorian architecture. It's got the Abbey, and I like that. Yeah,
it's not just one of these kind of London commuter towns that you get in so much.
No, it's not comparable with. It's not comparable with a lot of places in the southeast. It's got some character. It's its own place. It stands on its own 2 feet. It's not. You look at the statistics for commuting. More people commute into Reading than go out, despite its proximity to London. It's got a big football team. That's quite rare in the southeast. Outside London, London kind of sucks away the. Yeah.
It's actually the oldest football team in the southeast of England. I think it was established in 1870, so there's some history there as well.
So there's a big, it's got the big festival, which so there is more there than I would have expected. So I'm going to give it a 7.
7 is a good score. I think I'm going to go for 7 or 7.5.
It's hard, isn't it?
It is
hard.
It is because I kind of feel like it's making a rod for its own back by having so much that is so interesting there. I feel like there might be other towns where there is as much going on in the local museum or in the local history groups or the local theatre groups, but they haven't got as much material to work with. And I'm going to go, wow, this is really good. I just think there is so much in Reading that not many provincial towns of that size would be able to make enough of it. I'm going to give it a 7.5 because let's be honest, this category is made for towns like Reading. It's made for this kind of thing where you think nothing happened, and actually I can blurt out those statistics about what actually happened there, what sites you can pass in the town. If Reading had some kind of really fantastic new modern visitor centre which did all the things we've talked about, it will be up towards 9, 10. Absolutely unquestionably. But there is so much there. I think it's good.
But then if it had that, it might be better known.
It might be. But it would have to be a secret one. A secret one that no one knows about.
I sense there's a little bit of Reading-Oxford rivalry going on. And I think it would be interesting when we do Oxford, because Oxford does, of course, have this big reputation, very well known internationally.
Yeah.
And, and it's just up the road from Reading.
Yep.
Similar size.
Full of tourists. Can't move for tourists.
So it will be interesting to see how Oxford does in this category. So that's great scores. Do you want to round up the scores?
Yep. So we've got for political military influence 14.5, industry 12.5. Sorry, science industry I should say. Culture 11.5. Architectural and urban heritage 9.5, reality versus expectations 14.5. So that is a total of 62.5 points. And if you compare that with Swindon and Coventry, it puts it top of the league at the moment. Okay, well, that was Reading. Lots of interesting stuff there. Amazing how much stuff, as we said, happened right in the centre of the town with the people who live there today. I know for a fact just don't even realise. But now we get to move on to the fun bit, and it's my turn to quiz you now, Liam.
Oh, no.
For this bit.
Dear.
We do just a little light-hearted quiz based very vaguely on the theme of the episode we've just recorded. And today, Liam, your theme is the Reading Festival.
Oh.
Now,
okay.
You might like
Wow.
this. It could have been a lot harsher. I've got a random number generator, which is going to give me a year between 1971 and 2021.
Yeah.
I'm going to press this 5 times, and for each of them, you have to give me an act that played at the Reading Festival that year. So 1971 was the first year it was held in Reading. 2021, we go by the lineup as announced at the moment. 2020, the lineup as it was before it was cancelled by coronavirus. So, for example, if I generate 1996 at random, you have to give me an artist that played at the Reading Festival in 1996.
Brilliant. I'm hoping for low numbers here.
We're going to do 5 of these. Okay.
Anything after 2010, I'm going to struggle.
Well.
Okay, let's do it. Let's do it. Let's do this quiz.
Your first number. 1989.
Meat Loaf.
I don't think Meat Loaf was in the Reading Festival that year. Nope. No Meat Loaf. Okay.
When did Meat Loaf headline? He did headline, didn't he?
He did. Was that him? He did, but not that year. Famously, he did. 1989. You're going to kick yourself here. You could have had New Order.
I'm kicking myself.
You could have had Billy Bragg, and there's lots of your sort of music there. Okay, so 1989. Unfortunately,
Billy Bragg is my kind of music.
So 2003. 2003. What have you got?
Linkin Park.
2003, Linkin Park did headline.
Whoa, yes.
Well done. Not the only time they headlined. So that's 1 for 2003 there. Okay, what have we got? 1985.
Was this the period when it got really bad?
No festival held this year. I don't know why.
I think I got that one right, because I said, wasn't that when it was really bad? I think I should get a half mark.
I'll let you go again. How about that? That's fair.
Okay.
1995.
Wow, just so many big bands around that time. I'm going to go with Oasis.
Nope. Oasis have only ever played there once, actually, and it wasn't in 1995. 1995, you're going to kick yourself for this one again. You could have had the Smashing Pumpkins. Green Day. Hole. Beck.
This sounds like my kind of festival. Yeah. They don't make festivals like this anymore, do they?
No, they don't. Foo Fighters even. Oh, man, there's so many you could have picked there.
Give me a time machine. I want to go back.
Well, I'm afraid we're not going back. We're going forward because you just got 2014.
2014. Oh, goodness me. Little Mix.
You've got the Little Mix. I don't think it's quite their scene. No.
Can I change? Can I change my answer? Can I have...
I'll let you have another go, because that was very brave.
The Strokes.
Strokes have played at the Reading Festival, but not that year. Now, 2014, there's actually quite a few, which you're going to like here. You could have had Queens of the Stone Age, Vampire Weekend, Enter Shikari, Jimmy Eat World, Arctic Monkeys, Blink-182, some big names.
Do you know what? I was actually thinking Arctic Monkeys.
Papa Roach.
Papa Roach? They still going in 2014?
So we seem to have turned into a new metal podcast now.
It's 10 years too far forward.
Yeah, imagine it's amazing how long they can make one song last. So your final year, to try and bring yourself up to a respectable 2 out of 5 if you can, is 1986.
The Police.
The Police have headlined the Reading Festival once. In 1979.
Oh, right.
Which was your sort of year because that had Peter Gabriel in it, The Cure, Motorhead. I'm afraid 1986, I said, didn't I? Yeah, 1986. There's some really obscure bands here. Ones you might have heard of, Doctor and the Medics.
No.
Who did their cover of Spirit in the Sky. Hawkwind, New Model Army, Saxon. Not too many big names there. Yeah, the year that Meat Loaf headlined it, that you were thinking of earlier, that was 1988. You were 1 year out. He and Bonnie Tyler famously got bottled.
Disgraceful.
And then they brought New Order back the next year, bucked their ideas up. Although I like Meat Loaf, I won't hear a word against it.
Oh, I do as well. Well, that was absolutely brilliant, and I wonder how many listeners of this podcast have been to the Reading Festival in those years. Thank you for joining us for this second episode of Ye Olde Guide, and thanks to all of your comments on episode 1 when we went to Coventry. We really appreciate any feedback, either via the website, yeoldeguide.com, on social media, or through Apple Podcast reviews, whatever's easiest. Tell us what was interesting, what we've missed, and where we should visit next. We look forward to discussing your comments on Coventry, Reading, and everywhere else we visit in future episodes. There'll be much more over the coming weeks. We'll be visiting Bath, Swindon, Chester, a trip to the seaside. So join us in 2 weeks' time for the next episode of Ye Olde Guide.